equipping Muslims with principled, evidence-based responses to modern intellectual trends. In addition to his academic work, Sheikh Hammad has spent years teaching Islamic studies, delivering youth programs, leading Jummah prayers, and serving the community through education and mentorship. This evening, Sheikh Hammad will be speaking on the timely topic of Islam and liberalism, exploring the philosophical foundations of liberalism and how Muslims can navigate its ideas through the lens of the Quran, Sunnah, and the rich tradition of Islamic theology. Please join me in welcoming Sheikh Hammad Chowdhury. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him, benefit us through his knowledge, and grant us the ability to act upon what we learn, inshallah. Ameen. Jazakumullah khair.
الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. قال الله تعالى في القرآن الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم: أفرأيت من اتخذ إلهه هواه وأضله الله على علم وختم على سمعه وقلبه وجعل على بصره غشاوة فمن يهديه من بعد الله أفلا تذكرون. صدق الله العظيم. Sorry. Doesn't network name, sorry. Oh, okay. It's all caps, right? Maybe this is there another laptop that's already connected? I could send the file there.
Yeah, let's see. You wanna hook him up to the projector? Could you see other computers? I'm not sure where his is not showing it. I don't do voice. You know the cast for this? Yeah.
Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Jazakallah khair. Apologies for the delays. Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair to HIC Masjid and of course Sheikh Junaid and everyone else who helped get this program to be started, and Jazakumullah khair for everyone for attending. This is during a very, very special night, July 4th. It's a night where people are celebrating the independence of what many people call the greatest country in the world. And I think it's quite fitting for us to have this program on July 4th, because we are going to be critiquing and looking at what you could call the essential foundations of this country. Liberalism is not just the values of the left, the democratic left. It's actually the basis of what this entire country is built on. You could ask a conservative and you could ask a liberal, they'll still say that their core value is on liberalism, in a sense, liberty and equality. And we'll see that as we go through the program, inshallah. So with that said, we should keep in mind, we should think about what is liberalism. When we think of liberalism, the explanation of what liberalism is that it's a political and philosophical doctrine centered on the protection of individual liberty. What that means is that it's an idea that pushes for the concentration and importance and emphasis on every person's individual rights and his own free will. And we say it's a political idea because it relates to how the government should act and how the government should interact with the people and in society in general, right? So that's just the general idea of what liberalism is. We'll understand more when we look at the history. But in terms of what to expect from this program, we're obviously discussing morals and politics. Morals meaning what is good and what is bad. How do we determine that? What should we do? And politics is how the government implements that, how the government gets involved with us in terms of our own morals and our own values, right? Next is we're examining and critiquing the foundations of all liberal questions. I think we have an idea of what we mean by liberal questions, like war in Islam, apostasy laws, polygamy, the age of Aisha radiallahu anha. All of these questions, which came about only recently, these are all liberal questions, and we're examining the foundations of them. So the point of this program is not to answer every single liberal question, and those deserve its own separate program, its own separate time to discuss each and every single question, right? And the third thing is to examine how Christians had responded to liberalism, because liberalism emerged out of Christianity. And it's important to take lesson from that element of history, because we know in a hadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam that he says that you will surely follow the people of the book, meaning the Christians and the Jews, to the extent that if they were to go into a lizard hole, you will follow as well. What this means is that the Muslims, they will always feel inclined to follow the mistakes of the Christians and the Jews. And one of these fundamental mistakes that we've seen from history is how Christians, brought about liberalism and how they responded to liberalism. What were the mistakes that they made that caused liberalism to appear in the way that we see it in today's country? And what we can do to prevent it from appearing in our religion. And then finally, I want to conclude with a psychological explanation of liberal thinking, that why do people think like this, and why is it that when I talk to someone and I explain certain answers, it doesn't seem like it's getting through to the person. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at a certain point, He seals a person's heart, right? And it seems like nothing is getting through to the person. And the heart and the mind are connected. So what I want to do at the end of the section is to explain the psychological reasons why someone is thinking in a liberal way and how we can take a different approach in that method. Next thing is, why does this discussion matter, right? And the main thing I want to touch on is, people will ask that, why are you discussing the foundations of liberalism, and why not just address every single question, right? Why not just tackle the age of Aisha, tackle polygamy, tackle every single liberal question, and then that will give the answers. Whereas this program might seem a bit abstract. It's not going to be touching on one particular question. The first thing is that when we look at the foundations of liberalism, the principles, while we're critiquing that, we are building up our own framework of what Islam means in terms of morals and our own political view of what Islam means to be in this country. And that is crucial to have nuanced and confident engagement, right? If we just tackle each and every single question, then we're not going to have a clear framework of how Islam is meant to engage in this country, in this community. Whereas if we look at the foundation, that we build our own foundations, then we'll be able to have these educated and critical discussions based on critical thinking. And just as an example, unfortunately, we have Muslims today that are engaging politically with non-Muslims in this country. And the unfortunate reality is they're doing this without a clear conception of Islam and liberalism, where they conflict and where they converge in terms of morals. What can we agree on, what can we compromise on, and what can we not compromise on? As an example of this, people often assume that liberty is an absolute value that is shared of Muslims, Christians, liberals, and conservatives. And Muslims, in engaging in this discussion, they appeal to liberty. And in doing so, they say that we should have the right to express our religion however we want, invoking the value of liberty and saying that we all value liberty. The issue with this is that when we base our framework on liberty meaning the freedom to do what we want, we're going to run into some issues. And in any political discussion, when it comes to these liberal questions against Islam, many times the end result is, in your ideal Islamic society, in today's time, would you allow this and would you not allow this? Or what would be your position on this and what would be your position on this? And unfortunately, some people have gone to the extent to say that in order for us to have freedom of speech, we also advocate for the right for someone to curse Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Na'udhu billah. What I'm trying to get at is that if we buy into the idea of absolute liberty, then if someone pushes us on that value, eventually the person will have to concede that there cannot be any censoring of disrespect to religion, disrespect to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All this is just to say that when we have to build a clear and comprehensive framework of Islam, and this is through looking at the foundations of liberalism. The next is looking at just the contents of this program. Naturally, there are many contents, and we won't be able to cover everything today or for this program, but we'll cover the most important parts, right? And we'll look at the history, the three principles of liberalism, and examine some of their values, and then we'll get into the psychological explanation, inshallah. So with the history of liberalism, like I mentioned, liberalism came as a result or out of Christianity, Catholicism. And the start was with Protestant Christians. Protestants is a denomination, is a different group of Christians. And they emerged because they had issues during this time in the 1600s. The church and the state were together. And the government and the authorities of the time, they were using the Bible and using the scripture to justify and push any political agenda that they wanted to do, right? If they wanted to take a certain action, they'll find some verse to justify why they would do that action. These Protestants, they were looking at this, or these Christians, they were looking at this and saying, and they were challenging the authority. And they said, why is the government the only ones allowed to interpret the Bible however they want, and we have no say in this interpretation? And just not to spend too much time on the history of it, but it led to mass killings between Protestants and Catholics, right? Then the Enlightenment period came around in the 17th century, and people took the same logic and started to say that, why are these people in charge able to determine what is good and what is bad? And I can use my mind and use the science that is coming around at this time, and we don't need the scripture anymore. And scripture, religion, and God in general is just to be kept in the house, right? So hopefully we're following through with how this is progressing into what we have today. One of the important philosophers that started liberalism was John Locke, and his main idea is liberalism, which is to emphasize the importance of individual rights, human rights, and that no one can take your individual rights away from you, and that applies to even the government. And the purpose of a government politically is to allow each and every single person to exercise their own free will, their own individuality, however they want. And if a government is not allowing you to do that, then you are justified to rebel. You are justified to go against that government, right? And this led to things like the French Revolution, one of the bloodiest events of history. And that opened the doors to other events in history, like the American Revolution. People are celebrating it today. Moving on, we're looking at the three foundational principles of liberalism. So when the liberals, they removed God, they removed religion, they removed scripture out of the picture, they were left with a void. And the void was that now, before God or the church or the authorities used to tell us what to do and what not to do. But now that we don't have that, how are we going to decide what to do and what not to do? How are we deriving morals without religion? So they had three main principles. The first principle is the most fundamental, is how do you determine what is good and bad? And the answer to that is the hedonistic principle. The hedonistic principle basically says that whatever gives you pleasure, that is good, and whatever doesn't give you pleasure, whatever causes harm, is bad. So this gives them something that is easily measurable and easily testable, that, okay, does this please me? Okay, then it's good. It's a very simple formula, and I don't have to look at the Bible to figure that out. The next problem that comes with that is that what if my pleasure leads to someone else's displeasure, right? My pleasure will cause the harm of someone else. So in response to that, they have the harm principle, right? The harm principle says that you can pursue pleasure as much as you want, and the more pleasure you pursue, the more, the better it is, the more virtuous you are, but it cannot come at the cost of harming someone else, right? You cannot pleasure yourself, you cannot seek pleasure for yourself if it comes at the harm of another person. Then to round things out, they have the utilitarian principle, which essentially says that if everyone is pursuing their own individual pleasures, then we're not going to have a society. So in order to have a functioning society, we need to pursue the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So this prevents a dictatorship, right? Now one person, he might not harm other people, but he is maximizing his pleasure and minimizing everyone else's pleasure, right? So this is the three general principles. We don't need to spend too much time on them. But essentially, the main question that the liberals are dealing with these principles is, to what extent can the government get involved with our daily lives, right? Before liberalism came around, the church was very involved, and they would actively intervene in many issues, right? But with liberalism, it's whatever I do, as long as I'm not harming anyone else, then the government can't get involved. And that extends to religion as well. That when we want to tell someone that I think you should pray, I don't think you should be doing this, I don't think you should be engaging in this behavior, the person will say, I'm not harming anyone. And that's the justification that they have based on liberalism. So, just to see why this foundation is important in terms of all the other contemporary issues and challenges, these foundations essentially lead up to all these other confusing ideologies, to say the least, right? Feminism, LGBTQ, transgenderism, and materialism. Why? Because if we accept that we are pleasure-seeking animals, right? Basically animals that have no purpose in our life besides seeking pleasure, then we must accept liberalism, and all of these values emphasize the idea of seeking pleasure. Right? LGBT is just a way of increasing pleasure, that once a person gets bored on one avenue of this type of pleasure, then let's explore some more, right? So with that in mind, let's Well, it's obvious that religion stands in the way of liberalism, because the very values of religion and Islam in general is to go against the desires, go against your pleasures. As I mentioned in the Quran, in the beginning, I said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that, have you not seen the one who has taken his own desires as his God, right? This is the exact thing of liberalism. That once you take your desires as your God, then what does Allah do? He seals your ears, He covers your eyes and your heart. And you cannot, despite having knowledge, the person cannot be guided. This is what liberalism leads to, right? So liberalism, it seeks to atomize you. Atomizing means put everyone in their own single bubble, right? Forget about the family structure, forget about a neighborhood, forget about a community. Just stick to your own room, or order your Uber Eats, do your job through your remote job, and don't interact with anyone, right? That is the end result. That is the end result of liberalism, if you take it to its logical extension. That why should I have rights and responsibilities towards my wife, my kids, my parents? Why should I be bound by these things if it's not giving me pleasure, right? And I can get more pleasure with my phone, I can get more pleasure with whatever social media, entertainment that I have than what people say that you get satisfaction from in terms of a family. So these are all values that religion preaches and Islam preaches in general. Fasting, prayer, sadaqah, and even giving up one's life. These are all values that we highly emphasize in Islam, which goes against liberalism. The next thing to focus on is how Christianity lost to liberalism and how Islam remains. And we're going to see there's two reasons why, inshallah, through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Islam will prevail against liberalism. Again, it's a community effort that to push back against this tide. And what resulted in Christianity being what it is today? That even conservatives, their political idea is that, yes, even Christianity, even the church is not supposed to be part of government. And they say that whatever liberal values we have today, then that is what is meant to govern society. And why is Islam different? The first, despite foundational differences, we won't go over them because of time, but just very quickly, Islam is obviously more rationally coherent. It has a preserved scripture, and it has a detailed Islamic law. Christianity only has general laws, and it doesn't have a science of fiqh where it can adapt to every single society, right? But the first reason that I want to touch on is how Islam and Christianity responded to science. Because both religions, their society had an introduction to a big change in science, their own scientific revolution. When Islam was exposed to Greek philosophy and their science, it actually led to the Islamic Golden Age, right? Where Muslim scholars were becoming philosophers, were becoming scientists of the highest degree and actually pioneering in that field, right? So there wasn't a negative response to the influx of science. In contrast, as time went on, the scientific revolution around 1500s, 1600s, there was the scientific revolution, which is different from what Islam was exposed to. But how did Christianity respond? It responded with an inquisition, that many people, many scientists, they were killed because the scientific conclusions that they reached conflicted with what the church was preaching. So this led to the Inquisition, right? So both religions, they received an influx of new scientific knowledge, but their responses were very different. And because of this response from Christians, this is what led to liberalism, that they're looking at all this bloodshed that happened just because science is essentially refuting Christianity. So why should we value this religion if it's going to lead to this bloodshed and if it's going to go against our precious science? So this is what made them do away with the religion. And unfortunately, people lump in Islam alongside that. And they look at Islam and science as something that cannot be reconciled, just like every other religion. The second reason why Islam is different from Christianity is the scholarly tradition. As I mentioned in the history, there was an easy opening for the Protestants to challenge the scholarly tradition, the scholarly class at that time. And they were saying that, why can you interpret the Bible and I can't? I'm a human, you're a human, what makes you different from me, right? You're just basing your interpretations off of some tradition, some old tradition. I'm basing it off of science. I'm basing it off of logic, right? This disrespect or this dismissal of the scholarly tradition of Christianity is what led to liberalism infiltrating into Christianity. Alhamdulillah, Islam does not have that problem. However, there is, if we allow people to have that same line of thinking, then we'll run into the same issue of liberalism. That if we think about it, if we allow the people to entertain the idea that I can interpret the Quran however I want, I can interpret the Sunnah however I want, and I don't care about this tradition of scholars, and we have to think about the now and ignore the people of the past, that is what's going to lead to this liberal thinking. And this is what we have in liberal Islam today. And it's the minority today, but if we continue to allow people to think in this trajectory, then it's of course going to lead people to asking questions like, why is the hijab necessary? And why do we have to, why is there war in Islam? And all these liberal questions. So Islam still maintains a deep respect for the scholarly tradition through the madahib and the isnad chain of transmission. Madahib meaning the four schools of thought. As long as these are preserved, then this prevents people from saying whatever they want. And this is the same idea with isnad. Isnad meaning that whatever I say about the Quran and Sunnah, I'm not just saying it for my own self, I'm saying it based off of a tradition. That I heard my teacher say this, and his teacher heard his teacher say it, and it goes back to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And this is not found in Christianity. So those two things we should try to keep in mind in terms, again, the first one is response to science. And the first one is response to science, that Islam is not a religion that conflicts with modern science. And we shouldn't try to align ourselves with Christianity on that front. That to dismiss science, to dismiss modern science as guesswork and non-certain and things like that, right? There's no contradiction, right? Again, this deserves a separate discussion. The second is the respect for tradition and respect for the scholarly class. Just to put into perspective, there's an important emphasis on the scholars of Islam to not be very close to the rulers of the time. And that when the scholars become bound to whatever the ruler says, that is what causes corruption in the society, right? Just continuing on, in terms of examining liberal values, I don't want to go on for too long. We obviously have questions after this as well. But examining liberal values, we have to look at do these liberal values lead to the maximum happiness and minimize harm as they claim? Right? The first is to look at the principles themselves. How strong are they? How defendable are they? Right? Can they be contested? Do they have any holes? The second is, even if we concede these principles that you're saying your liberal values will give us pleasure and the maximum pleasure, is that actually the case? And we see it's not the case, right? Because sexual liberation just leads to broken families and societies, right? That why do I need to get married if I can get all this sexual pleasure that I want from my phone, right? And pleasure over duty led to social stagnation. We see so many people just not contributing to society. Why? Because they have no concern for society. They have no concern for anyone around them other than themselves. So again, why do I need to contribute to society if people are going to pay for whatever things that I need anyways, right? The extreme atomization again, singling you out and not having any connections with any other person, right? Connections, family ties, friend ties based on iman and faith, they're extremely valuable for satisfying the heart. The most important connection being your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Atomization is to only think about yourself, right? Be the best person you can be and only focus on what makes you happy. Right? And this is leading to depression and suicide, as we know, right? That the most liberal countries have the highest suicide rates. This is not just a coincidence, right? Again, just on the sexual liberation, this is a statistic I saw recently that I have to mention, but in terms of the average age for people being exposed to pornography, the average age was 13 years old. And I think it was 50% of people at the age of 12 had already were already exposed to pornography, and by 17 years old, it's 75% of people, right? This is the sexual liberation this is the promises of liberalism. The next thing we'll look at is the holes and the slippery slopes of liberal principles. That if we take these principles to its logical conclusions, what are some issues that we have here, right? What are some questions that we ask liberals that, according to your principles, you should accept, right? The ones I want to focus on for the most, the biggest one is incest, right? Incest meaning sexual relations between a brother and a sister, or a brother and a brother if it gets that far, a sister and a sister, right? Again, these are this is the trajectory that they're going in. Why do I bring up incest? To be crude, or you have to apologize, you have to forgive me for being crude, but according to their principles, if a brother and sister love each other and this is what gives them pleasure, then who is the government to get involved in that relation, and who are you to get involved in that relation, right? If people will bring up, it's going to cause harm because the child that comes out of them is going to have birth defects and things like that, because based on the scientific evidence. That's fine and all, but science and there are still pills to stop pregnancy and things like that. Or science can develop so much to completely remove those risks. So if those risks are removed, now we push the liberal and say, are you going to be okay with that? All right. Secondly, invasion of privacy. Again, you have to forgive me for being blunt about some of these things, but this is what we have to bring up, that if someone can spy on someone else and invade their privacy and gain his own pleasure through that invasion of privacy, but he's not harming the other person, and the other person has no idea, based on liberal values, what makes that immoral, right? What gives you the right to say that's wrong? He's not harming anyone, and he's pursuing pleasure. This is the hedonism principle. He's not harming anyone. Exactly, right? Similarly, necrophilia, right? Using a dead body to do whatever you want with it, right? Giving access to child pornography, right? This is, according to their values, the person is not harming anyone, and he's not harming anyone, and if no one knows, then what makes that immoral, right? Euthanasia pressure, right? Encouraging, again, based on utilitarianism, to be blunt, people would make the argument that the elderly and the disabled, they're only causing harm to society, right? And they contribute, because they contribute no benefit to society, it's better to tell them to kind of go the other way, right? And this is the dark realities of what liberalism will lead to, right? The only response that a liberal can say is that this is just weird or this is just gross, right? But can you say that it's immoral? No. Can you say that the government can get involved in these things? No. But is anyone going to say that these things is going to lead to a happy society, a satisfied society? Of course not, right? But liberalism is not giving the answer for a society like this. The only answer is Islam. And this brings us to the psychological explanation of liberal thinking. And we'll end with this. I think I'm already beyond time. So now, the psychological explanation, the thing we want to look at is, why do moral discussions between a Muslim and a liberal, why do they seem to go nowhere, right? And what does psychology tell us about the reason behind that, right? And this is even the case, even personally, right? That certain questions in Islam, certain questions against Islam, I or you, we might not feel fully satisfied with the answer that we're given, right? And why is it that? Why is that the case? Or I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to accept it because I'm a Muslim, because I believe in Allah. Is that an issue? We're going to touch on that, right? The reality is that everyone, including ourselves to an extent, our psychology has been rewired to a certain extent. People call this intellectual colonization by the West. That our minds have been essentially warped to think and to reason morally in only one way. To think of morals in only one framework and to ignore any other framework. And we'll expand on this. But the next thing I want to talk about is the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect essentially says that over time, as unbelievable as this might seem when you look at people outside today, but IQ has been on the rise, right? And again, IQ is not the only measure of what it means to be smart, right? It's just one value. But IQ is basically analytical reasoning, the way computers work, logic, math, how people measure things and things like that, right? It doesn't mean smart in every single element. But the people, the general population of mankind, their IQ has been increasing as time goes on, and especially when the Enlightenment period came about. This increase in IQ as people started asking questions that, okay, we're increasing in IQ, but are we losing out on something else that's important? And what many people say is that with the increase in IQ, people are the increase in analytical reasoning like a computer, we are actually losing out on something called intuitive reasoning, which is judging what I should do based on intuition, right? Essentially what my heart tells me to do. And this is what is being lost in today's generation, that the only framework that we can think through is through analytical reasoning. Does this cause harm or not, right? Whereas there are many other values that we have that is based on the heart, that is based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. And to further develop this, we have to talk about some weird people, right? Who are weird people? I'm sorry to say it's everyone in America right now, even us to a certain extent. Jonathan Haidt, he's an author of a book called The Righteous Mind, right? And he talks about, and he's addressing the same question, that why is it that when conservatives and liberals are talking, it doesn't seem like they're getting through to each other, right? And we're seeing that liberals are just getting more extreme and conservatives are just getting more extreme. And it feels like they're just talking over each other, right? That a liberal says that this is completely good, this is completely moral. Why are you saying this is immoral? And the conservative, he can't explain to the liberal why, or maybe whatever explanation he's giving is not working. Same thing, a conservative is saying this is moral, whereas the liberal is saying it's not. So he's trying to address this question, and his basic conclusion and what he says is that people don't think of arguments and deduce their morals first and then say what their morals are. In reality, what people do psychologically is, I already have an idea of what is good and bad, and then I'm going to justify it through whatever arguments that I can think of, if that makes sense. Instead of, it's kind of working backwards, that I already decide that this is good, now let me think of reasons why this is good. I think this is bad, let me think of reasons why this is bad, right? So now, who are the weird people? What he says is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. But in reality, it applies to pretty much anyone living in the West and even other countries who are affected by the West through social media and entertainment, right? What am I getting at? The same author, he talks about that before these weird people came around, right? Before these weird people came about, everyone had 5 fundamental moral foundations. That they had 5 values that determined what they say is good and bad. The first is care and harm, right? That basically the harm principle, that, okay, if I hurt someone, then this is bad, and if I give someone pleasure, then this is good. The second is fairness and cheating. This is essentially equality. That, do I get something that another person doesn't get for no reason? That's equality, right? The next 3 are important. Loyalty. This is something that people of the past, only about 200 years ago, people in the past and even people in other countries today that are not, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and all these things, people who aren't in that type of society, they have an extreme sense of loyalty, or they have a value of loyalty. Similarly, the value of authority, the respect for authority, right? What does authority mean? The respect for tradition, proper authorities, and the authority of God, most importantly. The 5th is sanctity, right? That something is special, something is sacred, that I'm not going to do this thing not because it harms anyone, but because it violates some sanctity that's there, right? So this is something that he notes was present before the Enlightenment, essentially, right? Before the weird society came about. And what happened with the weird people, again, you have to apologize about the weird people, but they ended up overvaluing these first 2 principles, the harm principle and the equality. The only framework that they can think through is, am I hurting someone and am I being fair to someone? Then they look at these other three values and they completely ignore it. Again, this is psychological. And when you bring up some type of value that's based on one of these three values, some type of moral that's based on one of these three values, they're just going to twist it into something else, right? So for example, they look at any type of loyalty that you have towards someone. They say, oh, this is just racism and tribalism, right? They just categorize it as racism. They look at any type of respect towards authority and say, this is just blind obedience, right? You're just ignoring your own logic and you're just blindly following someone, right? It's just irrational submission, right? So why are you going to follow what God says when you have science? When you say something is sacred, right? You shouldn't violate this thing. They say, how is it sacred? Materialism is the idea that there's nothing beyond the material world, right? This bottle, the only thing that this bottle is just plastic and some water inside. Whereas we look at it and we look at this as a source of life, right? This is sacred, right? That, for example, the water, in terms of wasting water, right? That essentially there's some, you can throw out water and eventually it'll get evaporated and then the water cycle will take place and then the water comes back, right? But we still say it's not correct to waste this water in whatever ways because it has some sanctity to it. Same thing with food, right? These are things which have some sanctity, but a liberal person will just look at it and say it has no value, right? The best way to hit this, to make this idea hit home is that we tell a liberal person that, can you explain to me why, if I punch someone right now, why is that immoral, right? Again, what will a liberal say? He says, you're violating the harm principle, right? But what evidence do you have of the harm principle, right? We have to think about, let's say there's some deranged lunatic, some serial killer, and he really just wants to kill someone, right? And he's just ready to carry it out. And the liberal is saying, hey, don't do that. You're going to violate the harm principle, right? The serial killer, he's going to say, I don't care about the harm principle. Explain to me why the harm principle is something that I have to care about, right? And the liberal will just be confounded. What will he say? He will say that there's something psychologically wrong with this person. That he's not computing, he's not understanding why hurting someone is immoral. Right? And it'll be like, just like how if I say someone who's blind, he might not know how beautiful like a sunset looks, right? And you try to talk to the blind person and say, the sunset looks like this and looks like that, but he's not going to compute what that is. It's like he's missing a sense. So the people who, liberals or weird people, they only have 2 out of the 5 senses, right? They only care about harm and they only care about equality. And when you talk about something about authority, just one example of authority, sorry if I'm going overboard. But for example, with authority, to show that this is not just a religious idea. Japan is one of the most irreligious societies that there is, irreligious countries. They don't have like a formal religion, like a strong sense of religion, right? But what makes Japan very different from America is their sense of authority. Right? They value authority a lot. Not authority of God necessarily, but authority of the government. That before even thinking about why a person should do this or that, if the government says so, then that is something that is good. This is how they compute it, right? And this is why you see they're very disciplined. They keep their hair a certain way. They have a very, very good social cohesion because they have this value of authority. And we have it as well, right? In Islam. So with that in mind, just like how the liberal, he'll be pulling out hairs, trying to convince the serial killer why hurting someone is bad, that's essentially the same difficulty that we have. That when we're talking to a liberal, and we're giving whatever answer we have to a liberal question of why there might be war in Islam, why there might be polygamy in Islam, whatever answer you're giving is not satisfying him. Essentially, the brute answer is that he's missing one of the senses, right? And it seems like a harsh reality to think that it's too far gone, but it's actually not too far gone. But it just takes a different approach. For some people it will work, but for many people, because they're psychologically wired to think one way or the other, it's not going to fully convince them, right? That the same way how if I want to convince someone that disrespecting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is immoral, he might not compute it just because he doesn't have the sense of authority, right? With that in mind, and we'll hopefully end with this, inshallah, which moral framework should we value? Or what I'm getting at is those 5 morals that I talked about, again, harm, equality, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. We have these 5 values, but if you take any of these and hyperfixate on them, then you're going to get issues, right? If you hyperfixate on authority, then that is actually discouraged, right? You are just going to kill someone blindly because your government told you to that this person's a bad person, right? If you hyperfixate on loyalty, then you're going to be a racist. If you hyperfixate on sanctity, then you're going to say things are sacred when they actually are not. So we need a balance across all these foundations. With liberals, they're only emphasizing the first 2. What I'm trying to get at is that determining what is good and bad is way out of a human's depth, right? It's way beyond our pay grade. To be able to balance each of these 5 values perfectly to result in a perfect society, it's way beyond us. So, Allahu A'lam, my opinion is that the best approach when it comes to this, if an answer to these liberal questions don't work, is to just convince them that Islam is true. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who created us, the one who knows us better than ourselves, He is the only one who can balance these 5 values in the best way possible, in a way that is not extreme and not too lax. It is only through the laws that is found in the Quran and Sunnah, that is found divinely from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we can actually balance these appropriately, right? So whenever we have a liberal question, even if we might not know the answer to that, we have to, the approach that we can take is, okay, forget about the answer to this question, because if I give you the answer to this question, you're just going to bring another liberal question to me the next day, right? Instead of me addressing every single one of your questions, let me prove to you why I believe Islam is true. Why do I believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists? Why do I believe that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is a truthful messenger? And that gives all the answers, right? They're the ones to determine what is good and bad, right? So it's this, we actually have a need for religion because of this reason, because of morals, right? That religion is not just something that's meant to be kept in the house, it's meant to be lived and breathed, right? We have to, this should be embodied in our daily lives, right? And Islam is the only religion that can implement this in marital life, in economy, and in politics. So with that, we'll end off, inshallah. Just to conclude, we have the three principles that they have. Do whatever you want, don't harm anyone, and try to make everyone happy, right? The holes and double standards that they have, right? What are some things that we can bring up that doesn't cause anyone harm, but everyone will say it's immoral, like incest, invasion of privacy. Again, invasion of privacy, why do we think that's bad? Because it's a violation of sanctity, right? That there's some sacredness to my own private life, right? And we saw how Christianity failed and how they were the result of liberalism, this type of liberal thinking, because they responded to science incorrectly and they did not respect their scholarly tradition. They did not respect the tradition of how to interpret the Quran and Sunnah, right? Next is understanding the psychological element and see how all the weird societies, in particular like America and all Western societies, they're only hyperfixating on what? Harm and equality, and ignoring loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And how this gives us an explanation of why certain answers to these questions might not fully satisfy a person, right? Just to very quickly end off, just an application of this, right? That people have questions about why are there apostasy? Why does Islam kill someone for leaving Islam, right? Whereas it doesn't kill someone for being a Jew or a Christian. Right? What's the difference between someone being born as a Christian and continuing as a Christian versus someone born in Islam and leaving Islam? Why is there a difference between that? Because there's a sanctity there's an authority in the respect for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you are already worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have the answer to your life, and then you turn away from it. Right? Same thing with suffering. Why does Allah cause suffering in the world? It's based on Allah's authority, and that's the true answer, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fa'alun lima yurid, la yus'alu amma yaf'alu wa hum yus'alun, that He is the one who does what He wishes, and no one can question what He does. Rather, you are the ones who will be questioned. This is the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and until we don't get that into our heads, then these questions will continue to come. And these questions were brought by shaitan in reality as well, that just the hyperfixation on the self, the nafs, right? free speech and war. Why can't I disrespect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, or why can't I curse the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in value of free speech? Because of the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Sanctity, right? Why is homosexuality wrong? We can make an argument that it causes harm to society, right? But the true value, that why we feel that this is immoral and why every single culture feels that this is immoral, is because it's violating the sanctity of how these body parts are supposed to be used, right? Why do women dress in a different way versus men? Why is there hijab versus not? Is because there's a sanctity to their body that is not for us. This is just determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Loyalty, this is important as well, that we have a sense of loyalty towards other Muslims. That if I prefer another Muslim over a non-Muslim, some people will call this as prejudice, but there is a value towards loyalty, right? So, here's some key takeaways, but just to conclude, we have to understand that a discussion of morality is way beyond our depth, and the answers to this is found in Islam. And perhaps we do dedicate and we cater certain answers towards these liberal questions, but our foundation should be in establishing Islam as the true religion. So with that in mind, we'll end the program, inshallah. In reality, like you saw, there were some slides that we skipped. This is actually part of a longer program. If you'd like, there is an organization called Madani Academy, and we have an institution, or we have a program called Kuba, Madani Kuba, Weekend Essentials, where it's a weekend program of Saturday, and we cover the important Islamic topics, the Islamic sciences, and one of them is Aqidah, which is beliefs. And in this program, we cover liberalism and all the other questions as well, feminism, and in terms of how Islam responds to these as well. So if you're interested, you can speak to me, inshallah. And inshallah, the semester just finished. We're going to be starting this fall, inshallah. With that out of the way, inshallah, I think we can open for questions. Or again, apologize for the delay, and so we're almost nearing Isha time. But yeah, any questions? Yeah, it's a good question. The question is, when I said that LGBTQ and transgenderism and these values are anti-Islam, there was feminism in there as well. And it's important clarification to be made that, of course, it's based on how you define feminism. And based on certain definitions of feminism, it is anti-Islam, and versus others, it is not. If we define feminism as respecting women and looking towards what will make them the happiest, Islam is, of course, pro-feminism, if you want to call it that. But the reason I just put feminism there is because no one has that level of feminism, that just to advocate for rights, for women's rights. Although that was the reason why feminism came about, because women's rights were being violated. In reality, it has taken a different turn today, and if we define feminism as advocating for men and women to be treated the exact same in terms of rights and responsibilities, then this is different. Then this is anti-Islam. That men have certain rights that women do not, and women have certain rights that men do not, and men have certain responsibilities that women do not, and vice versa. Right? So from that angle, Islam has a different formula that, and this is the formula, again, it's to balance these rights and responsibilities. It is beyond human ability, right? To give the exact rights that are meant for the men and women, this is beyond our human capacity, so we leave that up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever the Quran and Sunnah determines for a woman, and whatever the Quran and Sunnah determines for a man, that is what we accept. If we could just take another question, and then if there's no more questions, then we'll come to the next one.
I actually had a question. If truth is objective, then why are there so many Islamic schools of thought?
Good question. If truth is objective, then why are there so many schools of thought, right? So in Islam, we have the 4 schools of fiqh, right? Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali, right? I imagine that's what you're referring to, right? These are the schools of thought that's talked about in Islam. And in reality, the way we view these 4 schools of fiqh is that they are actually all correct, and none of them are sinful for following one of these interpretations. And the Quran is vague on certain particular details. For example, one of the most common examples is, do we raise our hands when going down for ruku and salah, right? Or just very minute details. In the fundamentals of Islam, for example, our beliefs, all schools of the orthodox schools of thought, they are united on the fundamentals of religion, right? What do we believe about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What do we believe about Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? We are all united on that. When it comes to fiqh, these are not differences in the fundamentals of the religion, right? There are just differences on how to implement the Quran and Sunnah into the society, right? And although one of them is the correct one, so that from that angle, truth is objective. That out of the four madahib, one of them is correct on the certain issues and discussions. But is the other school of thought incorrect in their judgment? No, because the person is exercising his fullest intellectual capacity to answer these questions. That they're not clear. Again, there are certain questions which are clear-cut. Does Allah exist or not? This is something that is objective and it's not up to interpretation. It's not, the only reason you would deny God is for to pursue your own desires, in all honesty, right? But in terms of some minute discussion of Islam, this is something that it's easy to make a mistake by, right? So hopefully that answers the question, inshallah. Yeah, sorry. Are the Shias considered a school of thought? The Shias, it's a bit of a difficult question to answer in the sense of, especially politically nowadays, but they're not considered a valid school of thought. They're not considered valid, and many of their beliefs are extremely problematic and against the fundamentals of religion, right? So they're not considered valid, and we consider them to be deviant. Jazakallah. Yes. Yes. SubhanAllah, yeah, Jazakallah khair. So the question is blind following something that is harmful to Islam, right? Or incorrect, right? Or is it ignorance? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is true that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He actually does condemn blind following, but in a certain area, which is in terms of belief. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, for example, when Ibrahim alayhi salam would come to his people, then he would say, don't worship the idols and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in response, the people said, how are we going to leave what our forefathers were upon? That our forefathers have been doing this for so many centuries, right? How can we just abandon that? This type of blind following, this is discouraged in Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically says after that verse that Ibrahim alayhi salam says, أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا. That what if your forefathers weren't using their mind, right? What if they were just blind following, right? So this is the encouragement to use our intellect, to think about beliefs, to think about why I believe Islam is true, right? In terms of the blind following that some people might discourage today in terms of fiqh, in terms of how to pray salah, this is not considered impermissible, this is not considered discouraged. Why? Because, again, it goes to the same question of the authority, that there are some questions in Islam that are not completely clear-cut on how to perform, right? Allah uses a word and it could mean one meaning or it could mean another meaning. So how should we interpret that? I know I don't have the qualifications to interpret the Quran the way I think it should be. So I'm going to trust a tradition that traces back to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right? So it's a tradition based on isnad, right? And one of the famous scholars, he said that if it weren't for this isnad, this chain of transmission, then anyone could say whatever they want. And this would lead to people inventing new ideas into Islam. Jazakallah. So what's the difference between liberalism and intuition? So in the psychological explanation, liberalism, basically the weird people, in other words, liberal people, they essentially maximize, or there's analytical reasoning and intuitive reasoning. Analytical reasoning is kind of like how a computer works, like whether this is logical and the maths behind it. So analytical reasoning, that is what is increasing, right? But and that is what liberalism is emphasizing on, right? That, okay, let me do the calculations. Does this hurt someone or does it not? Right? That's all it's based on. Intuitive reasoning is based on essentially what is in the heart, right? That why do I consider this thing as sacred is based on the heart and based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, right? So liberalism, we value both, right? We value analytical thinking and intuitive thinking, but there has to be a balance. Liberalism only values one. How far should we go? Sorry. Okay, inshallah. Yeah.
So, the society we live in America, it's not really easy to escape this liberalism. So how do you think as a community we should go about it to escape this liberalism or like have these values instilled in us? Because we're learning it in school, we can't escape it from work or anywhere in the community at all.
That's probably the hardest question of the day, but the question is, how do we escape liberalism, right? And like I said, we're all kind of weird in some one way or the other, right? Even at a deep psychological level, to a certain extent, right? Unless you've completely changed that. But this is beyond my pay grade. It's up to the senior scholars to fully understand how we should escape it. But again, it starts with just understanding the values of Islam and learning more about Islam as a whole, and not tying yourself down to making your identity as a Muslim first, before American, before you say that I'm a queer Muslim or I'm a feminist Muslim or things like that. Your number one identity that you should revolve yourself around is Islam. Then you take that, then you understand Islam from its sources, from its scholars, in its pristine form, right? Without looking towards any other questions, right? Don't let those questions bother you. And once you are firm in those foundations, then you could look at the liberal world, or you can look at it and, again, look at things from its foundations. And again, it just takes open conversation, like I said, about response to science and things like that. It'll only help Islam, inshallah. Yeah.
I have two questions, brother. My first question would be, does Islam oppose democracy?
Okay, does Islam oppose democracy? In particular, if we want to think about in terms of an Islamic society, right? How are khulafa appointed? It's not specified exactly how it should be, right? So in terms of democracy, the idea that everyone should have a vote in terms of who should be the leader, Islam doesn't say that this has to be how a government is ruled. It doesn't say it cannot be, but there's no strict limitations. An Islamic Khalifa could be chosen by the previous Khalifa. It could be selected by a council of highly skilled individuals to make that decision themselves, or it could even be open to the public to a certain extent, right? So in that sense, it is open to it. Yeah, Allahu A'lam.
And my second question would be, if morality comes from Allah, is something good because Allah is the one who commands it, or does Allah command it because it is already good?
Yeah, so the question is, when it comes to morality, is something good because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands it, or is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands it because it's good, right? So this is a deep and complex question to fully break down, but just in simple words, we believe in something called divine command theory, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the one who determines what is good and bad, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of all goodness, right? So whatever He determines, that will be good, what is good.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Hammad. Barakallah fikum. Everyone, despite the holiday, alhamdulillah, we had a good turnout, a lot of interest from our youth. And I know, Sheikh, this deserves more time, but in the interest of time, inshallah, we will wrap it up here today. We will go downstairs, inshallah, right now for a light dinner, and you can continue your questions and benefit from the Sheikh, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan.
Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Sorry.